Today we're going to be looking at the end of this period, right? What we're calling is the climax and the denouement. So when we get to 1799 and the end of all of these different struggles that have been going on for the last 75 years in Europe, and then what will come in the 1800s, which will be the topic of the next video, it's important for us to know, right, that there's a lot of different struggles being experienced throughout Europe. And the two factions, that we've been focusing over the course of the last couple of weeks has been the liberal versus the conservative perspective, the new order versus the old. And it's important for us to be aware that neither one of them is going to go down quietly. And the conservative faction, which again will be the topic at the end of today and looking forward to next week, will be the group that emerges, at least at first. The tensions with the new order and the tensions with the liberals will not go away. So when we look at Europe at the end of the 18th century, on the verge of the Napoleonic Wars, there's going to be a massive backlash. There's a new order that has been preserved, a new order that Napoleon will help preserve. It's semi-monarchical, it's semi-republican. It's a hodgepodge of a political ideology. Now, there's democracy that is attempted in places. But then there's repression of that and backlash against that, particularly in Poland, Ireland, and Great Britain. However, we still have places like the Helvetic Republic, and we still have places like the Batavian Republic and the Cisalpine Republic that are going to help preserve those ideologies, right? So if we look at this map in 1799 and we look at the different territories that exist, in 1799 there's still the Directory, and we are on the verge of Napoleon declaring himself the first consul. But then you look around and you have the Helvetic Republic, the Cisalpine Republic, the Batavian Republic, and all of these different places that exist. The Holy Roman Empire is still here, of course, and Britain is still a monarchy up here. But nonetheless, the concern, there are these pockets of the new order and backlash from the old. Within France, the Directory by 1799 has been going through major fights domestically. There are some, in a sort of self-preservation way, there has been attention being given to the Directory and certainly its less savory aspects, right? So the 5 people within the Directory, which again, they're not terribly important at the moment, at least. But their existence, right, is becoming more and more authoritarian. There is the small revolution, the small attempt at getting more power by the Directory in the 1790s, and nonetheless. But anyway, they do not support democratic actions in some places, right? So like the Directory does not support democracy in Ireland or in Naples, largely because they are of the more radical bent. But when there are moderate attempts at democracy, they do in the Cisalpine and the Batavian Republic. Throughout Europe, the conservative order is still controlling a lot of different attentions. Right, so Britain, for instance, does not approve of the Batavian Republic, and that's largely because there has always been a strong connection between the House of Orange, which is the royal house in in the Batavian Republic, or in the Low Countries, the Netherlands, and what will become Belgium, and Britain, and Austria does not support the Cisalpine Republic, largely because of the connection between Austria and northern Italy. So while France has its support divided, the same is true for the other republics that are existing and backlash towards them. When we look at the conservatives and the ways in which they view the world in 1799, there are many groups that are looking to restore the Bourbons and the old order, the Ancien regime, right? So the British are going to support the establishment of the Bourbons, and so will, obviously, so will Austria, and so will other members of the royal families throughout Europe. Now, the British offer £30,000 per month to help overthrow the Helvetic Republic, which was if you remember, the republic established in the Swiss territory. There's displaced people throughout Europe. There are French and Swiss emigres who have been kicked out of their homes and have wound up really in far-flung places, right? I mean, some come to the United States, while others go to Austria, others go into Spain, and others go into other parts of Italy. Now, we often would think, I believe, right, that their peasants generally would support the rise of democracy and republicanism. And that is obviously not the case, right? For a lot of peasants, the old order was something that protected them. The old order was a stable feature. For a lot of them, there is a sort of religious aspect to it. So even, within France, right, in the Vendée, which is the area in northwestern France, where there were those, if you remember, Republican baptisms where they drowned a whole bunch of priests. There had been a revolution there since the early 1790s, 1791. So what you see here is that they're still going to be in revolt, very concerned about the preservation of the conservative order. And the same is true in southern Italy, particularly in the area of Naples. And that is, again, because of the connection between the Neapolitans, the people from Naples, the Napolitanos, and the Bourbons. This also is part of the idea of agrarian conservatism, right? A focus on agrarian interests as separate from the city interest or the urban interests. And that is particularly true for some of the groups, right? Particularly Cardinal Rohan, who had made a lot of who had ruffled a lot of feathers with the diamond necklace affair, which we talked about 10 weeks ago now. That is something that is, he is so convinced that there's going to be a successful Republican demise or a rise of conservatives, that he is prepared to stay near Strasbourg and declare himself back into his diocese as soon as the battles are complete. Now, for the republics, on the other hand, there are still Republican fervors that are going on. And unfortunately for those Republicans, right, they require a lot of support from the army. They're the only way that they're really going to be able to survive is if they have strength within the armed forces, because they don't have the ability to otherwise maintain themselves. And for France, that is obviously true, right? Napoleon himself emerges out of the army in the 1790s, right? He is supported by the army. He has made his career as an army officer. He has served in Egypt. He has served in Italy, and he has now risen through the ranks, and as Talleyrand said, this is our man, right? He is going to be the person who will help overthrow the Directory. Now, within the Directory, there were political changes that were emerging. The Directory was becoming more democratically focused, and that is particularly true in 1798 with the election of the Abbé Sieyès. So the picture on the bottom left-hand corner, right-hand corner, excuse me. Sieyès was, he is famous, right, in the summer of 1789, for his pamphlet on what is the National Assembly, or what is the Third Republic, the Third Estate. And he is the person who gives the name to the original democratic institution of the National Assembly. He has continued through in his service to the Republic and in his service to the French Revolution, so that by now in 1799, he is considered a constitutional expert, and he is brought into the Directory with the hope of reforming the institution to try and bring a more moderate approach to the institutions. This is also one of the other pieces to this that's going to be troubling to some is the reemergence of social clubs and societies, right? They're the sort of holdouts of these old Republican ideas are going to be based in these societies and these groups. And as they emerge in the 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s, these ideas are going to continue to spread. And again, we'll talk more about that next week. So Napoleon becomes the first consul and then ultimately has himself declared an emperor. Napoleon's relationship with the quote-unquote New Order is a difficult one to assess, right? Because Napoleon does a lot of things that are part of this new order. He establishes the Napoleonic Code. He establishes the Bank of France. So the Napoleonic Code is a system is a legal code based on old Roman law that makes everybody equal before the law, no privilege to one group over another. You have the Bank of France being established, which is a singular bank to manage economic policy and to regulate currency, such that the king or the queen or the emperor or the empress or the directory or whoever is in charge cannot manipulate funds. It's based on a central bank to give out loans to individuals, but also to again regulate currency. The Concordat of 1801 is an agreement between the Pope and Napoleon. And all of the anti-Catholic, anti-Christian, anti-religion aspects of the French Revolution. The Concordat of 1801 brings religion back into France, but sort of in a slower status, right? It helps to reassert controls. Religious toleration, but also bringing back Catholicism. Then there's education reform. France is one of the first places to establish universal education. And by doing that, right, there is the establishment of the lycées. Again, this is a way to ensure that all people have access to education. All young people have access to education. But it also is a very nationalistic education, one that is focused very much on, in a lot of ways, a rewritten history. And then those are certainly New Order liberal ideas, right? But then if we look at what Napoleon ultimately winds up doing, he declares himself emperor, right? He swings back the pen, and he decorates himself as very much a regal emperor. He tries to conquer Europe and control the whole continent. And he installs his family members in a very dynastic fashion around Europe itself. By the end of Napoleon's reign in 1814-15, there needs to be an establishment of, and we'll talk about the wars and Napoleon's conquests in the final video, but when we look at the end of the game here, when Napoleon is ultimately deposed in 1814-1815, his deposing brings about the Congress of Vienna. And Vienna, there are four principles that are followed. One is to restore these old legitimate families back to their thrones. So it's looking back at the old order. Who are the conservative members? Who are the leaders that we can bring back? So Louis XVIII is installed as King of France. A Bourbon is put back on the throne of Spain. So there's different attention being paid, and certainly a conservative bent to that. There's a desire to encircle France with strong powers so that we don't have to worry about this ever happening again. There is compensation for land that had been destroyed and countries that have been destroyed. And there's a balance of power focused on empire. The Austrian Empire, the German Confederation of the Rhine, and then France, Britain, and so on. So out of the Congress of Vienna, there is a great attention being paid to conservative actions. So it's important for us to remember that those are the aspects that come out of this period. So when we look at the end of the French Revolution into the Napoleonic period, there are these two tensions that are existing. One where there's this old conservative movement that had been sort of grumbling underneath and in the background that now is reemerging and trying to reassert itself and is ultimately successful with the establishment of the post-Congress of Vienna world. But then there's also this democratic and liberal new order aspect that is there as well and trying to reassert itself and seen in some of Napoleon's actions.